All right, everybody, settle down. It is time for another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Very happy and excited to bring you this conversation. You know, last time I talked with Yasmin Nair, who's one of our favorite guests on the show. We wanted to kind of frame our conversation, our next talk around a particular movie or book, some kind of text that would kind of ground us, because whenever we talk, the two of us end up going in a million different directions. She really is someone who I love to have on the show because she brings perspectives that I hadn't really considered before. She challenges me. She's a writer who I think that if you haven't discovered her stuff, you should, because she pisses people off. I mean, our first kind of little subject that we talk about in this conversation is about the post office. Yasmin has a thread up on her Facebook right now about the post office and what we ought to do with it. And, you know, it really brought out like this massive response of people that are really kind of grappling with these bigger ideas. In other words, the post office struck a nerve, and Yasmin's really great at striking a nerve. She certainly does that when I speak with her. And so we wanted to focus our conversation. And so this time we talk about the film Rise of the Planet of the Apes from 2011. Yes, the one starring James Franco and Andy Serkis of Lord of the Rings and King Kong fame, etc. And we wanted to kind of like use that film as a way to talk about the larger issues the film brings up. It's a weird movie. It's this big, giant Hollywood reboot of a very famous series of films from the 60s and 70s. And it rebooted it like kind of for the 21st century. And it does a lot with ideas of prison, ideas of revolution, ideas of animal rights and environmentalism, even has a little bit of pandemic thrown in there. So we thought it would be a really great movie to kind of frame a conversation about that stuff. And so this is a long chat. I really like talking to Yasmin. I hope you enjoy our conversation. We've got more stuff up on the Patreon right now. There's a vibe checkup this week with me and Peter talking about some of the issues that come up in this conversation, which is kind of like, what does a global crisis do, and how can we envision a kind of local response to it, a kind of regional thing? I think we're all thinking in terms of like Trump and Bernie, and we've been thinking nationally for a while, but it's clear in this kind of 6th week of quarantine that this is playing out differently according to where you are, and we're wondering like, what are the possibilities for the left when you're thinking locally, when you're thinking regionally, when you're thinking smaller, in terms of envisioning being able to actually win victories, being able to actually build effective movements and institutions. So we get into that on the Patreon this week with me and Peter on our vibe check. And there's also our Deadwood episode. I should remind you, we're so proud of our Deadwood episode. Me and Justin Rogers Cooper went down the rabbit hole of Deadwood, and we're going to continue doing that. I think there'll be another Deadwood episode coming up very soon for our subscribers. So thanks so much for the people that are subscribing to the show, because I'm really having a lot of fun interacting with the community of people who really dig what we're doing on the Nostalgia Trap. And you can do that at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap if you want to join up and be a part of our crew. It's fun to hear these ideas thrown around, especially in the kind of smaller group of the Patreon. So thanks for all the people that are doing that. I hope you enjoy our Planet of the Apes discussion. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Yasmin Nair. All right, so thank you so much. It's so good to talk to you again. I wonder what, before we get entirely started, what's the view from Chicago? I'm not in a city right now, but what's it like where you are?
So where I am specifically is in Hyde Park, Chicago, and so in terms of the largest city in the state, we're fortunate at least. I mean, I never thought I'd say I'd be happy about certain authoritarian figures, but we are fortunate to live, in a state that's, has a fairly, I think, at this moment in crisis, a relatively okay Democrat governor, and we have a Democrat mayor whose politics remain troubling because there have been all these, I don't know if you heard recently, there was this demolition of a water tower in, I forget if it was Little Village, I think, but it's, a relatively underserved community. And the demolition caused a massive surge of, dust pollution. There was concern. Anyway, all of this has to do with the system of corrupt developers that Chicago, as you probably know, is ruled over by. And so there was that controversy, and of course she has been showing anger in public, etc., but doesn't actually want to really penalize the developer because, after all, the city depends on those people. So it's that sort of typical Chicago drama in the middle of all of this. She went and had a haircut after admonishing everyone, right? After admonishing everyone to stay at home, and she was so fervent in her messaging that everyone should stay at home, and if you don't stay at home, I'm going to shut everything down, blah blah blah. That there were these somewhat funny memes floating around of her, for instance, on Easter, she was looking at Jesus and saying, you need to stay at home and not run. So, there were these funny memes, and then she goes and does this thing where she goes and has a haircut. So she's being very typically Chicago mayor-ish. That's what I would say. I'm a little more sympathetic towards the governor. But again, I think we also have to be really cautious and say that these moments of crisis are exactly when that governmental structures also sneak in various other measures like privatization, for instance, right? And we have to keep an eye on that. So I'm reluctant to praise them too much because they are still politicians after all. And we live in Chicago and we live in Illinois, corrupt city, corrupt state. So there's all of that. And in Hyde Park, we're very kind of isolated. We sort of function like an island from the rest of the city. It's impossible to get out of Hyde Park without public transportation or a car. So I have not been outside the neighborhood for weeks now.
It seems like, it's funny, Yasmin, the last time you and I spoke was right at the beginning of this virus and pandemic becoming an American problem. And I think it was like early March you and I spoke. And now, it's to me like fascinating to watch it, like hearing you speak about Hyde Park and the governor, in particular mayor you have in Chicago, that like there's a like kind of regional flavor to the pandemic. Like you could have like a fucking like Trump governor who wants to like open everything up right now. I mean, depending on where you are, like you're going to experience this differently. And that part of it seems like it's coming out. I don't know. It's one of the trends I'm paying attention to as this thing explodes.
And I think we should, because I think especially on the left, we tend to completely ignore these regional differences. I think, as we've discussed this quite often, I think on your show, that especially the left media, tend to provide analysis and even reporting really in terms of where it funnels its resources only on a sort of coastal level, right? In a coastal way, it's either California or New York or things along those lines that really matter. And I've noticed, for instance, there are just these massive gaps in the coverage of what's happening in the middle of the country, right? Minnesota, Midwestern governors, for instance, are actually fairly resistant to Trump. They've been kind of banding together as well. That isn't really, I don't think, being covered quite as much as it could be. People aren't really interested to think about how the manufacturing industries, the kinds of different ways of earning a living that exist in the Midwest actually have a domino effect, right, in terms of the pandemic and how that has an effect on other parts of the country. I think those things might become clearer, but I don't know who the fuck will report on all of this.
It's also, I think you and I spoke at the kind of tail end of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we were both expressing our frustration that kind of like national presidential campaigns kind of swallow up the energy in the room, and you end up talking about like, I don't know, broad national issues. And that can like really flatten things out, and like you kind of ignore those regional things. But I want to make sure we stay on track today, because you and I tend to talk about. I was actually all morning I was looking at, or for the last couple of days I was looking at your Facebook thread about the post office and how like
let's do what
you pissed everyone off by daring to question the kind of sanctity of the post office as an institution. And it's funny because it struck up such a huge conversation. I mean, people can go look at your page and look at these threads, because the post office strikes a nerve, I guess. I mean, to me, reading the thread, I was kind of convinced by a lot of different perspectives on it.
Yeah, because it is a complicated history, you know, and I think on the left, again, we have this. First of all, I think a lot of Americans are architected to this very idealistic 1950s movie version of the post office.
The nostalgia trap. Yeah, literally.
Yeah, we're on the Donna Reed show, right? Where Ted, the friendly postal person, comes along every day and has some cute things to say about your dress and the golden retriever dog and all of that. And that's just not the post office anymore, really. It's become, that's a whole other conversation. It's a long conversation. But it is interesting to think about how Americans in particular are architected to this idealistic idea of the post office. And the only way you can have a conversation about it on the left is to say, we must resist privatization, completely ignoring the fact that actually many, many, many people in many parts of this country are deeply underserved by the postal service. And yes, that has to do with neoliberalism, that has to do with, the problems of private, sort of the creeping privatization we see, all of that, absolutely. But what I found so striking about that entire conversation is that those who were criticizing me, first of all, wanted to say that I was for privatization, which I'm not. And then they refused to even acknowledge that living in a part of the world where you can't even get fucking mail in the United States is actually a sign of the very same degradation that neoliberalism brings about. So what I find fascinating about the left is its inability to think that there are actually two kinds of people who are being underserved by the postal service. The first, of course, are the workers right now, absolutely, who are, for the most part, not even being given, many of them, my postal workers here, the ones that I can see, are not working with gloves or masks or anything like that, right? So there's that. There's also just the cutting of benefits, the fact that many postal employees now are actually contract employees. We don't even know that or understand that. There's all of that, the exploitation of the workforce, absolutely. But then there's also the exploitation of people, of human beings. What is it going to take someone dying from a lack of delivery of essential meds for the left to finally say, I guess that's a problem? Whereas, mail is important, right? Mail is important whether it's a card you get from family or people are sending cards, especially now, whether it's postcards, messages, or whether it's, a gift that someone sends you, or whether it's your meds. Mail is important. It's a we decided a long time ago that getting things like mail, whether it was by horse carriage or now that is like a function, an essential part of what we might call civilization. Yeah. It's really important to people. And so I found it astonishing during that entire thread that people can go visit, that there was a complete refusal to understand that the lack of mail service was not an unimportant thing, but a very important thing. And that there are postal offices here in Chicago where you are completely degraded as a human being once you enter as a customer.
Yeah, that's the point that I thought was an important one that didn't show up enough in the thread, is the kind of like the experience of going into these spaces, which are like institutional spaces. Whenever you like touch the government, and especially as you go down the socioeconomic ladder and go to neighborhoods where poor people are living, people of color are living, like the places like the post office end up like having this really like, and maybe this will get us to our bigger conversation, but like they have, I mean, it's like a carceral experience. I feel like I'm going to be arrested when I go to spaces like that.
Me too.
And you kind of get in line in this like really kind of drab gray building, and like in other words, the kind of the institutional culture of the place is really a drag. And like, yeah, I think that if the further you get away from that, and the further you're having things delivered to your house, and you're like a kind of person with money that does that, you don't feel like you need the post office. Like
exactly.
In fact, I think like a lot of like podcasts, like I don't know, like mainstream podcasts, whatever, the ones that are like monetized, they have ads on them. And like one of the biggest ads that I hear on podcasts is for stamps.com, and their whole pitch is like you can pay your way out of like the like horrible experience of going to the post office. So like it's in the culture. Like people know they don't want to visit these places, but then you have this really kind of like grassroots left defense of the place at the same time, which comes from the impulse you're talking about, which is like, dude, it's kind of mind blowing that you can like for a few cents, like send a letter across the country. Like that to me is still something impressive that the post office pulls off. So if we can take that impulse and wrap it into an institution that's not such a prison-like experience, maybe we can imagine something different for it. But yeah, I just wanted to point people to your Facebook page because you've always got, like, I would say, quote unquote, thought-provoking conversations on there, but also you have a way of stirring up the nest, and that always is interesting because it brings all these different kind of voices. And my friend Justin always says, like, if you're angry, you're revealing like too much, and like and there's a lot of that there. But so you and I both watched this film. We agreed we wanted to talk about a couple points. Last time you and I wanted to talk about like animals and prisons, and we thought of together watching this film from 2011 called The Rise of the Planet of the Apes. So both of us have just watched that film with I think it's the pre-canceled James Franco is in the film, along with John Lithgow and a bunch of computer animated apes. But just to start us off, had you seen this film recently? Had it been a while since you'd seen it? I didn't realize it was 9 years old.
Yeah, I saw it when it first came out, and I don't recall if I saw it in the theater or not, but I saw it when it first came out, and then I saw it I decided to watch it today rather than last night, partly because by the time I got to starting to watch it, I was feeling a little tired. So I thought, let me just get up in the morning and watch it with fresh eyes. And it was incredible. My first thought was, David and I are going to have a really hard time sort of, keeping on track because there's so much to say, right, about this film. So it's really, as you say, pre-cancellation James Franco. This is when James Franco was, I don't know, the bad boy / genius celebrity who was getting what, like 4 PhDs or something. Utterly ridiculous scenario. But this was at the height of the James Franco fever that overtook the nation. And then Frida Pinto, an Indian actress, and I realized, I wonder where Frida Pinto is today. And John Lithgow. And as you point out, yes, a lot of animated apes and Andy Serkis, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Caesar, and we can talk about the whole notion of acting. But yeah, I watched it, and of course, as you know, right, the end of the film, it made me realize, I had forgotten about the pandemicness of all of this.
Yeah. The final shots of the film, well, actually, I guess it's over the credits are kind of showing the virus, and you can continue the movies, like they put another one out in 2014 and the final one in 2017. And I continued watching the trilogy, and the pandemic becomes kind of the main plot as the human beings are dying off and the apes are kind of taking over. Mm-hmm. I don't even know where to begin with this film. I think the main for me, like, maybe I'll throw this out. Like, it's a really Hollywood movie. Like, it's very kind of like, I was rolling my eyes at a lot of kind of the little plot turns and everything, but at the same time, it's this weird kind of like prison abolition movie. Like, it's just like, has a weird politics to it where like the human beings are the bad guys essentially, and Caesar's whole kind of progression is realizing his status as a subject within this like carceral state. And like, there's so much to that. There's like almost like the whole film is like a discourse, and this is what I wrote, and I wondered if you would agree, but like, there's like this discourse of consent running throughout the whole movie, like this discourse of like that Caesar holding out his hand and they're saying like he's asking permission there, and it's kind of like weird acknowledgement that that's a big part of like our kind of civilizational discourse, is like whether or not you doing this is okay, and like getting permission. And the other like kind of moment where that's nailed down is like Caesar's first words in prison, like the first word he speaks, that's like the big moment in the film, is no. And him like saying no to basically a cop who's like beating him up. Yes. Like, I thought like, so in other words, it's a kind of weird mix of like Hollywood glossiness and like this kind of radical politics underneath it. Or am I reading that the wrong way?
No, I mean, it's as you rightly pointed, it's a weird, complicated film. And I think it's all of that at the same time, right? It's a Hollywood film, and I think, so And I think you and I both read film the same way, which is to say, we don't go into film thinking, is this an art film or is this mere entertainment, right? We're able to look at everything as a text unto itself. And I think we give credit, I wouldn't say credit, but we are able to read culture by giving it the place that it's due, and to say that, everything that is produced within culture speaks to, right, certain cultural tensions. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the weirdness around that prison sort of theme that does run through the film is precisely because the prison theme that runs through culture is so fucking weird. And we haven't really reconciled, right? Especially in, 2011? Was it? No.
Yep.
Yeah, 2011, when the discourse around prison abolition was not even inclined towards reform. There wasn't even that really bubbling up towards the surface as it is now. I mean, today we've got Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, right? A premier prison abolitionist featured in the New York Times, sure. Mm-hmm. But that was not the case at all. Prison abolitionists like Mariam Kaba, Gilmore, and of course, Angela Davis were heard but not really recognized or considered. And of course, the fact that they're all Black women, by the way, is something also, to be thought about. But yeah, so I think the tensions around, right, prisons and all of that are exactly evocative, I think, of the tensions around how we think of prison, right? Is it something that we think is desirable? And I think so, therefore, it's significant that it is a story that involves apes, right? And as we are reminded at the very beginning, they're not monkeys. We can talk about that whole thing about distinction between species, right? We're told very clearly, not a monkey, but an ape, right? So the human hierarchies are imposed from the very beginning. But that those tensions around, what we think prisons are they cruel and degrading? And the fact that we can only think of them as cruel and degrading when we think of them as things that are cruel to animals in a way is really interesting to me. And what's also, of course, interesting, right, is the history of the Planet of the Apes series, which I think there are quite a few of the original. Mm-hmm. I forget how many, but the original series was very much grounded in a discourse around civil rights. That was sort of fairly... Yeah, I don't think there were no one was surprised that this was, that there was a metaphor of our race going around in terms of the bodies, right, of the apes versus the humans. There was no surprise, I don't think, at the time. And so I was thinking about that. I was thinking about race and prison and that moment that you point to of permission, right, that you are always asking permission. There's that moment when the first time is when Caesar is taken to the redwoods, which reminded me of Vertigo, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's funny. I was thinking the same thing.
Right? Yeah. So for those who are listening in, Vertigo, one of Hitchcock's one of his absolute classics, features a very famous scene with Kim Novak and James Stewart, where Kim Novak's character looks at a ring inside a redwood tree, a slice of a redwood tree, and they trace, the idea of millennia of time, in terms of the rings of the tree, etc. And that's all short in this astonishing. It's the exact same forest, actually. It's the same park, and it's in San Francisco, etc. So yeah, there was a Vertigo sort of reference for me. But that moment is when he's taken off the leash and he looks at Jane Franco's character, and there's a moment of supplication, or is it in their backyard? I forget. But it was weird for me because there's Frida Pinto, who's an Indian actress. Mm-hmm. And that gesture of supplication to me read very much like the gesture that mendicants and hermits and so on make in India when they ask for alms. And I don't know if this is like, I looked at that and I thought, okay, is this just me having come, being from India, right? And being very familiar with, because that gesture is it's very much that it really is that gesture of supplication in India. When people ask for alms, beggars or hermits and so on, that's the gesture they make.
Yeah, he's like kind of like putting his hand out with his palm up, and he's kind of like bowing his head down before James Franco. And it is in the forest there. Yeah, and it's a critical moment because it's like the moment of self-awareness for for Caesar, because after he puts the leash back on, they run into another couple who has a German Shepherd on a leash, and it upsets Caesar because he sees the leash and he realizes he has a leash on.
Yes.
And James Franco's asking him, "What's the matter, Caesar?" And Caesar signs and says and asks, "Am I a pet?" Which I thought was one of the more profound moments in the film, because he's kind of like, "Am I a pet?" And then he asks, "What is Caesar?" And it's the first moment that he kind of like understands those hierarchies.
Right. And yes, so and it's interesting that the hierarchies. This film is so much about. I want to get back to the question of prisons that you raised, but I was also just thinking about the ways in which we can't get away from our vision of nature. So just as we have this very conflicted view of prisons, right? So prisons are horrible, prisons are degrading, but they're degrading and they're shown in their absolute brutality, right? The confinement, the torture. There's also that moment when he is hosed, which of course, again, I was thinking of the older films and I was thinking about civil rights discourse and I was thinking about African Americans being hosed, all those photographs, those iconic photographs that we've seen, right? Of people being hosed during civil rights movements. So, there were those ways in which the film was evoking race. But in terms of prisons, it was interesting to me because I thought, when do we see in mainstream cinema, a look at prisons as degrading as they are? And that's possible when we envision animals inside cages. Yeah. And it always hits me and we've talked about that in the last time, right? We are more empathetic, we're more empathic, we have more empathy in certain issues when we think about them affecting animals more than we think of them as affecting humans. So
why do you think that is? That seems like an impulse that everybody has, or it seems like
in America.
Maybe in America that's a good thing to point out, actually, because I'm thinking of like those infomercials with like Sarah McLachlan or whatever, where they show like kittens being tortured in cages and stuff like that, and they're just like these horrific kind of things but it's almost like a cultural joke in terms of like how traumatic it is to witness that sort of stuff. And it seems, I wonder what your thought is on that, because I'm subject to it too. Like when I see or hear about animal abuse, it triggers a kind of rage in me that's like, equal to or more than the rage I feel when I see or hear about human beings being abused. And I wonder if you experience the same thing. Where do you think that comes from? Is that just because apparently it's more an American phenomenon than maybe in other countries?
I think so. Although what's interesting so I should say that, when I was growing up in India and I had a dog and people were sort of, and she happened to be a dog who had been picked up from the streets. She was a neri kutta, to use, a Bangla word, which means, a wild, not wild, but like a stray dog, right? And there was a lot of contempt because she wasn't a fluffy Pomeranian. So among the upper classes, which is where I grew up in India, the preferred dog was either, a Great Dane or a fluffy little Pomeranian, neither of which was suited to the Indian climate, I might add. And my dog, the rugged, mutt that was a mixture of Alsatian and Doberman and who knows what else, was far more suited to the environment. But so the point being that when I was growing up in India, there was these, having animals as pets was, still sort of unusual and all of that. And you didn't have things like, people really didn't have cats, for instance, that much. There wasn't such a thing as litter. What is interesting is that with neoliberalism, owning animals and having animals like cats and dogs in your house has become a marker of many things, including class ascension.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But in India at the same time, of course, there is enormous cruelty to animals. Still, because there are lots of stray dogs and stray animals on the streets. And I can't even begin to describe the cruel conditions under which, they have to survive. But there's also a rise in an animal rights movement and so on. But the point I want to make is that the ownership of pets as opposed to animals which are simply, in terms of animal husbandry, as it were, right? The ownership of pets is very much a marker of class. And I think in the US, what is interesting is that that's also, I don't think it's necessarily that long ago that we didn't actually think about animals as pets necessarily. So it does, I think, also here as well. But I think there's been a shift in terms of, sort of an economy that thinks about agriculture as central, in which case you think of animals as animals, right? You think of them as providing food or whatever, and you think about animals as creatures you take into your home. And it's I don't know, we'd have to think about historically what was the shift in terms of animals to pets, right? There's that shift, and I would imagine that it has a lot to do with urbanization, for instance, right? Issues around companionship, where animals begin to function to help us cope with the supposed quote unquote isolation that urban living brings with it, etc. Right? There's all of that. But I also think there's something about the weird contradiction in the US that I've always been struck by is the slaughtering of animals on a mass level, right? Which is to say the extraordinarily cruel ways in which, we get our beef and our pork and all of that. And the contrast between that and how devoted we are to our pets.
Yes. Yeah. That's a big one. I don't know how to square that. And I never really have, because I eat meat.
I do too.
Yeah. And at the same time, I'm sympathetic to certain kind of vegan outlooks, particularly when it comes to like climate change. But when you get into like kind of the moral element of it, it's really, really tricky. And that part of it is weird. And it seems like so arbitrary for each human soul kind of comes to this weird kind of contradiction in themselves in a different way, I guess. But like, certain animals mean more to us than others. And like that's like just the fact of it. Like dogs and cats, we would, and that to me seems like totally arbitrary and totally culturally constructed. So like dogs and cats are cute, and we would never eat them, and we'd be disgusted by them. Horses, that's a good example, because cultures like France eat horse meat, and it's not a big deal. But here in America, the idea of eating a horse is like just sacrosanct, completely insane. So like that part of it seems like a totally like culturally and economically defined thing. That like, yeah, if you're a dog or cat, then we're gonna post pictures of you online and talk about how much we love you all the time. And if you're a cow, fuck you. You're getting in the factory to
right.
get ground up into meat for us. And that part of it is weird, especially when you like understand that cows and cows are cute too, right? I mean, they have. It's weird to like, in other words, like endow one species with some sort of like magical soul, and another species kind of deny that. I haven't, and as a person who eats burgers and loves cats and dogs, I haven't really been able to square that contradiction myself. How about you?
I haven't. And my only way of reconciling that contradiction is to say to people, listen, if I'm ever hurt to death or mauled to death by, if I'm ever torn apart by an animal, I ask that you please not kill it and that you let it go. And, that's all I can offer. And that, and also, the fact that I genuinely love animals. I don't know how, that's such a weird thing to say, but I do have an intense, it's beyond rapport with animals. I have an intense connection to animals that I think I often don't have with human beings.
Yeah.
And I don't think that makes up for the fact that I eat some animals, but I don't know how to reconcile the contradiction. I don't know how to give up meat. And I know my vegan and vegetarian friends are rolling their eyes as they listen to this, but I don't know how to give up meat. And I care deeply about animals. I
wonder what that has. What's the politics of that? Because like you think about animal lovers and like
what is that? And right. Like what is this thing about loving animals? Yeah, what is that shit? Seriously, seriously, what is this shit? Right? Like, what am I trying to cover up by saying I'm a lover of animals? Yes.
Yeah. Well, also just like it seems like, and I think about the kind of like, because I'm from Southern California, and so like the kind of like hippie left, the kind of like very like soft like animal, what like the right, like what Rush Limbaugh called like tree huggers, like tree hugging wackos, like all that kind of animal rights thing, like that Earth First shit, like to me, like, that was a big entryway into like thinking about the left. Was I saw that stuff around me in the 90s and 80s and thought to myself, well, I care about the earth. I care about animals. Like, so I should be on the side of this kind of like, left, whatever it. In other words, it was an entryway in the left thinking about animal rights. But the point we're making here, it seems like, it's a weird thing because, it's also to be a quote unquote animal lover can also make you a big misanthrope, like people that are like,
yes.
Which is like a weird thing to be a left person at the same time you're kind of like antisocial. It's just a really big sentiment. You see like people that are like the more people I hang out with, the more I love my dog kind of thing.
Right.
And
like yes, definitely.
Yeah, so like that all these impulses are really tricky to navigate for me.
No. And you know what? You said something just now, and this actually brings me to the film as well. You said something about investing, or seeing that animals have souls, or investing them with the idea, at least, of a soul.
Right.
And I was, as I was watching this film and watching, especially towards the last third of the film, the world sort of just crumble and implode, even though it's really only happening in San Francisco. Also, by the way, I have no idea how perhaps 50 apes suddenly materialized into, I don't know, thousands of them.
Yeah, it's like a fucking Lord of the Rings battle at the end. There's so many of them.
Yeah, I was doing the math and I was like, wait a minute, where are all these coming from? Okay, I'm not supposed to think logically. Just move on. But what is interesting is, so there are two things I want to think about, right? Which is this question of the soul in the animal. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we could connect that to Andy Serkis and the idea of acting and the controversy around whether or not to give Andy Serkis
yes.
any kinds of awards at all for his acting, right? So I want to think about that. And I also want to think about how this film helps us to think about the ways in which we invest nature itself with a kind of soul and personhood, which I think, just to, big spoiler here, is total bullshit. I think about nature, so you were talking, so to go just to the nature part of it, right? So animals break out of prison, and the idea is that they then flood back into nature, and especially the redwoods, because of course, the redwoods provide this very beautiful backdrop, right? And inaccessible ones, especially these gigantic trees, and they escape back into nature. And of course, the idea throughout the film, right, because it's also about the way that Caesar becomes Caesar is that his mother is injected with a drug that could potentially end Alzheimer's. So, and we want to talk about that as well. This question of memory and retention of personhood, etc., through the John Lithgow figure. There's that.
Yeah.
But the ways in which Caesar becomes, Caesar, the way in which he becomes Caesar is that his mother is injected with this, and in an attempt to protect him, she attacks humans. She's killed. As a result, Caesar is sort of, taken away quietly in the dark of night by the James Franco character, grows up to be Caesar, and the drug, which has been passed to him through his mother, enables this kind of extraordinary cognitive ability, which, as you pointed out, at the end of the film, we realize, oh my God, he actually now knows how to speak, right? So he says no very loudly, and then he says now to everyone to tell them to attack the humans. So that idea of escape, the question of, I think what the film is trying to say is that, well, if we actually knew what apes were capable of, or what animals were capable of, this is what they would do. They would return to nature in this way. And I was struck by how the film is kind of saying that, we're upsetting the balance of nature, etc. And I was thinking about what we've been talking about all these last many months around the pandemic. And these extraordinarily, for instance, stupid ideas that, Venice's canals, right? There's a stupid story going around. I mean, stupid is the only word to use for this, right? This idea, right? The Venetian canals were now filling up with dolphins. And, because nature was returning, right, to its natural sense of being. And it's always struck me, that we, on the left in particular, have this sort of weird eco-conscious politics where we think about nature in these very actually humanized ways. We think of nature as this wonderful earth. I mean, the very metaphor of the mother, right? Mother Earth. And we depend on, for instance, indigenous activists will constantly evoke that metaphor as well. You know, we are despoiling Mother Earth and she's taking revenge upon us, or we must return Mother Earth, we must heal. All these sort of the language that we use, you know, healing, trauma, wounded, breaking, etc., sort of implies that there is something essentially conscious and there's a being, a sentience to nature, which I think is utter rot. Because we need to think about nature as a series, as a system of systems. In some ways, I think we need to think of nature the way we think of capitalism when we have the brains to do it well, right? Nature is not a sentient being as much as it is a system of systems. So when a system, when we start, and I was thinking about how with this pandemic, for instance, you know, to get back to this notion of returning to nature, right? One of the myths around, well, it's not a myth, it is something that scientists are actually seriously considering, which is that this pandemic began with bats, right? That began in the wet markets of China, with bats that hosted the virus being eaten by humans, right? So right there we have this idea that, you know, it's wrong to eat bats, and that's why we contravened some sort of mutual contract. And I'm like, okay, first of all, and as someone, you know, I think I was watching someone on Democracy Now! Pointed out, listen, people eat bats all the time. It's a cheap, good source of protein. You can't demonize, you know, eating habits for that reason. That's not the issue, right? So this issue around that we've somehow broken some sort of contract that we had about species and interspecies relationships, whether it's about eating them or, for instance, I can recall, you know, in the early years of AIDS, and it still floats around now, right? The big thing about AIDS, the biggest rumor is, AIDS all came about because a guy fucked an ape.
Yeah, I remember that being like, I mean, because I unfortunately, or, you know, maybe fortunately, whatever, I was in like junior high when the AIDS crisis was going on, so that's like already a time when people are just like really gross in the way they speak, and those were the like primary kind of founding mythologies that I heard again and again and again, was that, yeah, either someone had sex with an ape or someone had eaten monkey brains. The story was always that it was quote unquote in Africa.
Yes, of course.
And it honestly, it fell in line with the kind of like, I don't know, the Orientalism that was popular in culture at the time, in terms of like, I'm thinking about like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. They eat bugs and monkey brains and snakes, and this idea that like, wow, fucked up foreign people somewhere do fucked up shit with animals, and that's what caused this. And it like pats our culture on the back by saying we have a good relationship to animals and nature, and we don't do that kind of backward shit. But all of that seems like it's fucking, I don't know, racist urban legends to me.
It is totally. But also it ignores, you know, saying things like, so for instance, okay, so it is perfectly possible that, you know, a bat was infected with a virus that someone ate and that it spread as a result, or many people ate many bats, more likely, right, infected with the virus. But that's not a breakdown. It is how things work. So I think what is interesting to me in the film, you know, and in the ways in which we talk about the pandemic, because the film ultimately tells you, is again doing a very classic, is providing a very classic narrative, right? Which is, if you contravene the laws of nature, this is what will happen. If you contravene the laws of nature, this man will be infected with a virus and start spitting up on everyone, and then he turns out to be the pilot who's going to fly a plane.
That's right.
Right? Broken finger, I'm not sure how. But anyway, he's going to fly a plane, and they show you at the very end, right? They show you all those international destinations spanning the globe, literally. And the message is the message that we see, you know, in the next few films, which is that this is what fucks up the world. The world is broken because of that. But, you know, if we were to routinely rather, you know, obviously for us, it's dangerous to have things like viruses, right, affect us the way this one is affecting us. But I think our response needs to be less, this is unnatural and more, this is how a system works. And also this is how nature works. It works as a system. I'm not saying that there aren't scientists who aren't saying this, but I think the general discourse, and this is discourse that we see in this film in particular, is more like, nature is a sentient creature whose law has been broken.
Right.
And that, I think, is so bizarre and completely unscientific, frankly, and ridiculous. And I think this is also why so many people responding to natural crises don't really know how to respond except through this kind of humanization, right, of nature. Which brings me to this question of the soul that you talk about, a soul that you see, I think, in prison especially, and prison is what gives the apes their souls. That's what's interesting too, right? It's Caesar, totally. Right, who literally goes around. Also, I'm not quite sure why cookies were what brought about the revolution, because he has his bag of cookies and he goes around giving each of the 8 prisoners
a cookie. What I wrote? It's so funny because that whole prison sequence, for whatever reason, I think I've studied the Vietnam War more than anything else in my life, and so like thinking about Ho Chi Minh's revolution and like kind of like how. That's the parallel I was making this film. That's why the film that sequence especially feels so kind of like revolutionary. It's like seeing this kind of piece by piece how a kind of revolutionary leader is born in prison and the things that he has to accomplish in order, like he has to prove first he has to like prove physical dominance against the like other like king shit, alpha male ape in there, and he achieves that by humiliating him in front of all the other ape prisoners. But yeah, there was also I wrote in my notes the cookies are how Caesar earns trust by providing material benefits and how he endears himself to the population. So there's all these different he's proving in front of them, he's making like a performative display of like, I am the leader figure here. And like that part of it is an interesting through line in the film, is that like Caesar's whatever makes him a good leader is also what leads to like the corruption of the apes in some way, because there are other apes that are trying to like dominate him, and like it creates a whole. I mean, not to give away the whole series, but like the whole series is kind of like is pessimistic in some ways about the possibilities of this, because the apes ultimately just replace humans and like are ultimately like the same kind of shitty, cruel, subjected to all the kinds of same hierarchies and everything else as humans, and that's kind of the point of the series, at least one of the points.
Right. But in that moment, as you point out, it's him realizing cookies are what will bring them out, literally.
Right.
And a new taste as opposed to the slop they've been eating and so on. And yes, his skills as an organizer, his skill as a revolutionary, his skill in terms of being able to take them out. But the interesting thing there also for me is the question of what you raised, right, which is the question of the soul and the discovery of the soul in prison, first of all, but also it made me think about the whole controversy around Andy Serkis. I think I have his name right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But I was thinking about the notion of so this movie, there's so much to say about this movie that I can barely keep going. I'm just like, and I have this to say. But this movie was made very specifically with a lot of technology that enabled them to create these digitally produced animals.
Right.
Apparently, the director was very firm that he said, I think he actually apparently said that, if you're going to make a film that's critical of cruelty towards animals, we really need to not be using animals of any sort, because there is no way to use animals in filmmaking without, especially if they are quote unquote wild animals. There's no way to make films with them without being really cruel to them and so on, right? So it's extraordinary, the achievement, the technological achievement. I mean, the film really holds up well even right now. So it's pretty impressive. But I was thinking about the idea of Andy Serkis acting. And it's interesting because everyone's been, I think at the time people were saying, well, he's such a great actor because he can do all of this without the limitations of a body. But if you actually look at Caesar's emotions and so on, they're not necessarily animal emotions. And, how do we know how to act as an animal anyway?
Right.
They are very human. And if we saw Andy Serkis demonstrating those emotions in a human character, we would define him as someone who was overacting.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So So I was fascinated by this idea of a soul represented through this thing that we often talk about, which is the idea of acting as an art and as a technique, and how much emphasis we give to this notion of acting, right? Like, what is a good actor? And that has shifted dramatically, as we know, so in the earlier days of film, if we watch early films, for instance, they're they're notorious for overacting, would be with very heavily dramatic, melodramatic kinds of acting, partly to do with the technology. And now we have, and then we get method acting, and now we have sort of naturalistic acting. Speaking of which, by the way, James Franco is actually not bad at all. None of them actually. He's pretty good. I was kind of surprised.
But it's funny. But Caesar's really the standout of the film. Like this, like Caesar's the star, and you're right. They had to have the technology. I mean, this is the same guy that plays the Gollum in Lord of the Rings and King Kong even. So he like in Peter Jackson's King Kong. So he had some some primate experience. But you're right. There's kind of like. He has to. Caesar's character almost comes off like a silent film star, like Buster Keaton or something, where it's like where there's like a kind of histrionics to the way he's performing. Definitely. That you definitely like kind of have to, because he doesn't talk, and so you have to like see this his like exaggerated emotions on his face. Yeah.
Yes. And also they don't. My understanding about, for instance, chimps. When they launched a chimp into space. This was in the early, sort of Sputnik-y era. Mm-hmm. And I think when he came back, when they took him out, he was, as they said, he was so happy he was grinning from ear to ear. But actually, when chimps do that, and he does that in the film, right? There's a moment when Caesar and the orangutan are laughing, right? And he kind of shows his teeth and laughs. Mm-hmm. That actually, among chimps in the natural world, is a sign of intense fear. Mm. So that poor chimp who had been launched into space was terrified out of his wits.
Yeah, we're sitting here trying to read human emotions onto right.
So that was interesting to me. And again, I do think it relates very much to the themes, we're picking apart, including that of prison. And also, the question of what happens to John Lithgow's character, right? Who has Alzheimer's and who is sort of losing his mind, as it were, and is losing his beingness, right? And then this virus supposedly the virus that is actually, not the virus, but the whatever it is, the serum or whatever that enables Caesar to be so highly cognitive, allows Lithgow's character to regain a sense of, again, who he was in a past life, right? And that also is somehow connected, I think, to this notion of consciousness and the idea of the soul, and regaining, again, the idea that someone who has, for instance, either Alzheimer's or even autism, right, is somehow descending into an animalistic state from which we must rescue them is also very humanoid, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the plot of the rest of the series, if I remember, is that the humans that get this virus, as the virus evolves over time, I don't know if this will happen to coronavirus, but it ended up like affecting their speech patterns and like turning them into apes. So that like they literally are like they're turning into a more animalistic behavior, and that's seen as kind of like the loss of humanity, the loss of civilization is turning into animals.
Right. And then in contrast to that, supposedly we're supposed to see Caesar as an embodiment of a move away from that because he's becoming more human. Oh, look, he speaks, he can say now, and then he can say, to Franco's character, he can say at the end, right? He says, Caesar is home now, right? So, but what is interesting, that sort of always bothers me, because I think that if we were to think about people with, say, what we think of as cognitive failures, or people with autism, right, as people who are simply navigating the world in a different realm, as opposed to a failure. And now, which is not to say that these things are not issues, right? So someone who is, suffering old age decline, for instance, has forgetfulness, right? Forgets how to do very basic things. There's a moment when Caesar has to, reposition the fork in his grandfather's hand, and so on. So I'm not saying that these things are not problems, but what's interesting to me is that we construct a world where, instead of working with someone who is in that kind of cognitive decline to build a system that accommodates them, we're constantly obsessed with how to bring them back to quote unquote our world.
Yeah.
Right? And the same is true of autism. Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, whose name I forget, is actually a very, very famous, one of the most famous researchers of autism. And he developed this sort of method that is supposed to help children with autism learn how to smile and show different kinds of emotion. And I haven't looked too deeply into that, because I've been working on autism a little bit. But the thing that struck me was, why? Like, why is it necessary for, like, why? What are we invested in that we say a child must show this set of emotions in order to be considered fully human?
Yeah, and the end point of it in the film, and it's something that kind of parallels the way that our society doesn't really have a way of dealing with mental illness, because we see it as like just basically outside of the norm, and is like they say. At some point, they have like a nurse who like says, I can't handle, like John Lithgow is having a particularly difficult day, and she says, I can't handle this anymore. We have to put him in a home. And in other words, the only like kind of endpoint we can imagine for someone's mind degrading is like a carceral answer. It's like prison again. It's to me, it's I think about the 80s a lot, and like Reagan closing like state hospitals, and then like that turning into an even worse. Not that the state hospitals didn't problematic institutions and carceral in their own ways, but like when you get rid of that support network, at least here, I mean, in California, I know it happened in cities in the Northeast too. You get this huge rise in homelessness of people who are like outside of that spectrum of like what works in neoliberal capitalism. Call them schizophrenic, call them mentally ill, whatever. And yeah, like those people, like in other words, our culture has no way of like creating a space for like people that don't or can't kind of experience the world in the same way that the quote unquote normal people do. Right. And the result of it, like for homeless people, has been like, well, whatever state institution touches them now is likely to be a cop, and is likely to be jail, and is likely to be, the shit that happens to Caesar in this film. So like that part of it, they barely touch that discourse, and like that, but there's that, that quick allusion to John Lithgow's character, like if he can't behave, he's going to be in a home, and like that part of it is something that, in a pandemic age like right now, I mean, I feel like these conversations just get lost as people are like talking about wanting to go back to fucking,
nature.
That kind of thing, and like there's this kind of for me, and I know you're talking about this too, and like, the pandemic moment is a moment where we can kind of maybe imagine ways out of some of those bigger kind of conundrums, because that part of it, I don't know, it came up in that film, in the film a lot for me, is the idea of like kind of these, we don't really have institutional answers for these questions.
We don't. And the only way we know how to create institutions are institutions that constrain, institutions that are often set up that are to be ripe for abuse, for instance. There's just this fundamental cruelty, I think, in the discourse that we've evolved around our relationship to the natural world, which we imagine as somehow superior and life-giving, in contrast, obviously, of course, to those who would, for instance, take over the national parks and develop them, perhaps. So yes, so I mean, there are certain obvious things we can say, right? Don't yield the national parks to privatizers,
well, that's what's weird, right? Is that at the same time there's this, we're identifying this like kind of cultural reverence for nature where we kind of see it as godlike. At the same time, like the main story is like corporations and private capital and banks just fucking destroying the planet, and like that part of it, that's a weird thing to have. I think maybe the romanticization is maybe kind of born of that in part, because I think, right? Because I think of like the 60s and like Silent Spring and like, like all this kind of like the 60s notion was like this kind of collective discovery that capitalism was fucking the globe and like fucking up the environment, and like that particular, in other words, that's a brand of environmentalism. It's like a particular like kind of like romantic vision of environmentalism that's still with us, and seems like it maybe could be shifted. It seems like that's what you're suggesting.
Definitely. I mean, I shifted and perhaps even just dismantled completely, which I think is going to be impossible. But we can at least maybe talk about shifting it somewhat, right? So, for instance, we could say, instead of thinking, instead of using even just language, even just metaphors like Mother Earth, let's stop using language and metaphors that disable us thinking about how corporations and so on are parts of system attacking another system.
Yeah.
That's one way to think about it, right? So I think, for instance, with COVID-19, for instance, let's stop speculating. And I'm not, I think on the left, obviously there is a lot of cynicism about all these idiotic ideas about, it was created in a lab and it was let loose, et cetera, et cetera. That is just, was that Mila Jovovich series, Red something? Anyway, there's a whole film series. There's a game around that. But I mean, it's a popular trope, right, in science fiction, which is something gets created in a lab and then escapes because of someone spills a beaker or something like that. Those are idiotic narratives, certainly. But there are ways to think about, start to think systemically. Part of the problem there, though, I think, is that there are certain humans amongst us whom we also think of in animalistic ways. And I think what's interesting, of course, about, for me, what's so interesting about Rise of the Planet of the Apes is its relationship to, a whole series of films in the 60s, which were all about race, for sure. And so race is interesting in this film in how it's both sort of clear and not really clear, as not as clear as it was in the earlier set. But I'm also thinking about Native Americans, and I'm thinking about the notion of the indigenous person as somehow elemental. And every time I see coverage of Native American issues around the environment, I just always want to shut off the goddamn TV or the radio, because it's completely fucking useless, And I watch these protesters, for instance, around pipelines and so on, and sometimes they're often Native American. And it's all replete with the imagery, the drumming and the clothing and the narrative. On Democracy Now!, I endured watching a woman for a long time going on about, just yelling at the developers going, "You are taking away Mother Earth." And I'm just sitting there going, this is fucking useless.
It's funny because like it goes to power, right? It's kind of like this is so okay. The people show up to create this pipeline, and they've got the full force of the military state behind them. They've got like fucking tanks, helicopters, everything else, and there's this person sitting there being like, "Don't hurt Mother," and like. That part of it, like, I understand it. Like, I get, like, that it reminds me of, like, the Pentagon protest. I think it's in 1967, like, the famous picture of, like, the hippies putting flowers in the guns. And it's kind of like, the guy can just pull the trigger and shoot you, right there. I mean, it creates a cool image. And, like, I guess it, like, in some ways, like, communicates the terms. But, there's no kind of notion that we're going to win here. There's just like if it's just like kind of like we sit here and just say, we're the Earth protectors while the other side has fucking nuclear weapons. It's kind of like you're not playing the same game at all. It's a weird way of approaching it.
It is. And of course, one always hopes, but one knows that one's hope is futile. One always hopes that behind the scenes, there's some extraordinary systemic analysis and organizing going on. But I doubt it. I seriously doubt it.
It makes the apes on the bridge look a lot tactically smarter because the apes, the apes show up and they realize that the cops are in front of them. I really love that scene.
Can we talk about that whole sequence?
That sequence is amazing because I'm like cheering. It's honestly kind of crazy because the bad guys are the cops and the cops just get beaten the shit out of them. Like there's big victory moments where there's even a victory moment where the gorilla who's like kind of Caesar's main muscle throws a cop off the bridge and kills him and he beats his chest and it's meant to be like a big victory. But either way, those apes don't just stand there and like throw up a peace sign or like put a flower up and say, instead what they do is they use their physical kind of prowess to climb up on top of the bridge, and then the orangutans go underneath the bridge. They approach the police and essentially like create a diversion and then flank them. It's basically like a classic kind of military technique that they use.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and they really show it in detail, which they don't really show in a lot of films, which is kind of like how an actual kind of a crowd that's outgunned could overcome. Yeah, and so it's like literally, again, I'm making the Vietnam analogy because I'm sitting here being like, wow, this is like they're showing like a group of unarmed people kind of overcoming the state and overcoming the power of the police there. And it's really exhilarating. It's kind of like, it's a fucking crazy moment.
It's fantastic. It's completely unreal because, again, we have no idea how so many apes came out of from where, but that it is extraordinary. And that moment where they overturned the bus on its side, or rather, and then they use the bus as a shield against the bullets. And the cops have no idea what to do. And then, of course, that's the moment, of course, right? Speaking of hierarchies among animals, we have this brilliant, amazing, astonishing moment in the film where Caesar comes riding on this, on a horse.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's the moment I suspect in the theater where everyone just went, cheering, because how could you not? It's such an extraordinary moment.
And also, look at he's handling animals now. Like he's now learned. In other words, like we're going to watch the whole evolution of the human race happen again, like overlaid here. And like here's this phase where they discover that they can fucking ride horses, and in the next film they discover how to use guns, I think.
Yes, and so it's that sequence. Yes, I think it's something that we can watch over and over again because it is so incredible, completely unrealistic, but really quite incredible. And that moment when the old ape, that I think is also interesting. I kept trying to think about where this film not exactly landed, but what this film was doing around race, right? And you have at the very end the corporation, the CEO, the owner, who is black.
That's right. Yes.
The one black figure, the one black human who actually has dominion over everyone else because he's got all the money and the power. And he's stuck in this copter and he asks Caesar for help. And Caesar kind of looks to the sort of the right and we're wondering what is he looking at. And then the old ape who has been incredibly just brutalized, who's half blind and so on, by this man, comes up and just shoves the copter off the bridge. And that's, again, that's like his revenge, as it were. So, and that was a moment, I was trying to figure out again, so I guess what I'm trying to think about is, in the earlier versions, right, in the earlier iterations of the series, the idea of African Americans being represented as apes was definitely on the surface, as it were, right? I mean, that was very much a part of the film series, right? It was a very, for its time and even now, it's actually a really interesting film politically. And its politics are, for the time, certainly radical. And I think even now, they're really interesting, right? And that's not so much the case in this film, which has apes in their most sort of natural state, as it were. And that was interesting to me that you don't really see that sort of allegorical significance, right, of apeness as African Americans or African American, that isn't there quite so much.
No, not nearly as much as it was in the older films. And you're right. It's more just kind of about kind of like, I don't know. That's why the film has a kind of a Hollywood blankness to it in the end, and that's what's disappointing. Is like, you can make those you can make those connections yourself. I mean, the kind of to me the clearest one, if it were a connection to race at all, and I don't even know if they were intending it, but like. Caesar and the orangutan at some point in prison realize that they both can sign. And the orangutan says to him, like, be careful, the humans don't like smart apes. And it was, and that made me think of Frederick Douglass, and it made me think of like kind of, education and self-awareness and that sort of thing. That was, definitely a through line in the story of like African American history. But like at the same time, it's not that overt. They don't really make it. They don't really make that connection. I mean, you can. I mean, you sit there, you're like, it's very easy to make that connection when you see like the prisons and you see that like even like Caesar is a product of like his mother being shot to death by the police and like that part of it. But yeah, it's instead.
And yet you would have to labor to bring those you would have to sort of labor to bring that to the film, and it would be, I think.
Yeah, it's a much more 21st century.
It was sort of there.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I wonder, part of that maybe the reluctance also, to be like, oh, we're not going there, right? Which I can understand.
Right.
At the same time, as you say, I would totally understand it. But at the same time, to not also think about race and say prison, or race and, as you point out, right, race and, mothers being killed, right, while protecting the children and so on. It's an interesting, it is interesting. It's a kind of a depoliticized redoing of a series that was extremely politicized.
Yeah.
And it's depoliticized in a different way, where towards, I think, what looks like a radical politics on the surface, because, hey, apes taking over the earth, what could be more radical? So it looks like a radical politics, but it isn't nearly as radical as the older series,
Yeah, well,
it's still an interesting film. That doesn't mean it's not an interesting film which evokes certain questions for us.
Well,
certainly.
I think it's because it's in part like what you're identifying is what we're talking about with the whole kind of wider cultural thing about nature. It's got this kind of like blank, like nature is good, the primitive is good, people and progress are bad, and it does it in like a way in a way that's like kind of disappointing. I mean, the dude that gets thrown at the helicopter, the CEO of the pharmaceutical company at the end, like the one black character in the film, really,
right?
He says something at some point, like James Franco says, like, should we do this? Should we do this experiment, even though it's dangerous? And he says, yes, we're going to do it because you'll make history and I'll make money. And you're kind of like, well, that kind of, it's, in other words, it's all about this one CEO character making lots of money. And it's kind of like this blank greed, rather than realizing that, like, it's like the film explaining to you why the pharmaceutical company is part of a wider problem systemically. It's more just kind of like this bad guy, this evil kind of capitalist guy. And yeah, I wonder if by robbing it of like any, because you're right, it doesn't. I'm trying to think, like, this film came out the same year Occupy Wall Street was happening, and you're kind of thinking like, well, how is it? It's not really corresponding to that politics very clearly, and I think maybe as the films progress they do a little bit more, but it kind of leaves you with just kind of like these blank ideas of like the apes are the good, but they're eventually gonna be corrupt, and the way they get corrupted is because they're just like us, they're bad, their impulses are bad, which seems like a very when you're thinking about that nature as sentient and us as the bad guys, that seems a very like Christian way of looking at things. It seems like, like
this is also true.
Like, I don't know. It's a film that, like, you're right. It's got these radical notions in it, but it's kind of frustrating at the same time.
It's very James Franco, in other words.
That's great.
That was James Franco, not to bring it back to his celebrity, but that was James Franco all through that time period, This sort of supposedly radical guy, but he wasn't anything but that, and, time has proven us right.
It's hard to take him seriously. He comes off, like, when he comes in with his, like, lab coat on in the beginning of the movie, I feel like he's, like, he's walked on from a soap opera. I know he did that soap opera thing, too, as, like, an art project, but, like, that seems like a long time ago now. That seems like a different world.
It does seem like a different world, and thank goodness we're past that massive James Franco moment. But
well, yeah, he was teaching seminars at NYU while I was there, and they were like, I think one of the seminars was called Editing James Franco, and it was entirely about the students doing different projects, re-editing his films together, and like making different versions of his.
Don't get me started.
It's so meta.
Yes, it is so meta.
So yeah, I mean, I think we talked this out. I mean, there's so much more we could say about Planet of the Apes, and we can kind of maybe continue our conversation in another episode. But this was really fun.
This was great. This was wonderful. It was a really interesting film to watch, and let's do another one around another film, or
yeah, sounds good.
Something, I had an idea a little while ago, and when I remember, I'll shoot it across to you. We were going to talk about homes as well at some point, I think.
Oh yeah, the housing thing, landlords. I mean, there are so many elements of this like pandemic crisis that are like bringing out some of the like bigger conversations on the left. Yeah, I remember you sending me something about housing that made me think a lot about kind of the way people are. I mean, it even came up in Planet of the Apes. The homeowner that's next door, the neighbor, like his initial.
That was so peculiar. Yeah, we should talk about the neighbor. The neighbor was really peculiar. It was a weird plot point. You know, it was completely, again, unrealistic, because you have the same exact neighbor who, in a sense, takes the narrative forward at least 2 or 3 different times.
Yeah.
And it felt so artificial. So that was just bad writing, you know.
Definitely.
Let's have this one character be the fulcrum for 3 different things. And at the end of the film, of course, he also turns out to be possibly, you know, the source for a pandemic worldwide.
Yeah, and he was kind of a stand-in for like reactionary white suburban homeowners. Like at the beginning, he's like attacking Caesar with a baseball bat and being like, "Stay the fuck away from my family and my daughters," you know. And it's just like, it was kind of a over the top, definitely like the worst element of the film. Yes. But I feel like I can see what they were trying to do, which was like try to show how like Caesar's path of incarceration, like he's basically like, if we're doing the race thing, he's this like black boy who's been adopted in the white suburban neighborhood. And like now he's
this is true,
right? And now he's causing trouble. And the neighbor is the guy that's like, he's going to be the first one to call the cops. He's the one that's going to like be the entryway into Caesar's like path of incarceration.
This is true. No, that you're right about that.
It's a rich fucking text, this movie.
It is. It really is a rich fucking text. Absolutely. The other thing was you had a question from one of your viewers.
Oh yeah, let's
or rather one of your listeners.
One of the listeners sent this really great question.
Yes.
Yeah, let me bring that up, because that was I think I have it in my head, but I can bring up I can bring up the email, because I'd love to read the actual question, because the last time you and I spoke, we had talked a little bit about prison abolition, but I think one of the things that made this come up is the idea that there are on the left especially, there's this weird contradiction between like being a prison abolitionist, or at least a performative prison abolitionist, or someone who's like against the cops and hates authority at the same time, and wants to like overturn the whole system of justice, etc. But at the same time, there's like this like kind of fetishization of like the guillotine, and like wanting to like incarcerate and punish, literally physically punish the people, like punching Nazis and all that kind of stuff. And there's like weird contradiction. And so let's see, I have the question here.
Yeah, I can send it to you. I think.
No, I think I've got it right here. Yeah. Okay. So. Here's the question from Andrew, and thank you, Andrew, for asking this. It says, "You've probably recorded already, but I'd love to hear you speak more, maybe in your next episode, about something you and Yasmin Nair spoke about. You talked about the contradiction in the left, where people who believe in prison abolition also want to see people like Harvey Weinstein rot in prison or worse. Can you talk about how you're able to curb your own punitive instincts with regards to people in power, like the senators who are very likely insider trading, or people like Edward Gallagher, who was pardoned for war crimes in the Middle East, or ICE agents who are abusive towards immigrant families, or war criminals like Kissinger or Cheney, or price gouging pharmaceutical CEOs? What would justice for these people look like in a world without prisons? Most left-leaning commentators will speak about prison reform in one sentence and French Revolution-style punishment in the next. So it's refreshing to get some new perspective on this subject. I found that so thank you, Andrew. I found that like a really challenging question, and something that it's for me, it's not unlike the veganism or eating animals question, where I'm like, I haven't really squared the contradiction. But how do you respond to that one, Yasmin? Because that's a tricky one.
It is. And, so for me, and I'm by no means the expert on prison abolition, though I consider myself one, and I have some experience with processes and the principles. So, of course, the first principle is no prisons, that's one principle. But for me, I think 2 basic principles that overdetermine sort of reparative systems, right, would be: take away the things from those who have created the harm. Take away the things that enable them to cause that harm. That's one thing. And the second is make them, compel them to engage in a process that brings repair to those whom they have harmed. Sorry, there's a sound. To bring repair to those they have harmed, and without completely dehumanizing themselves in the process. So now Kissinger and Cheney, that's a biggie, right? But I think there are ways to, with Kissinger and Cheney, the big problem is how much these men have been validated in terms of the power they've been able to accrue because of what they've done.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and Kissinger in particular, fucking war criminal. How do we, the geopolitics of it are so immense, right? And his crimes stretch across continents. And also they have cumulative effects over the years, even when he's not directly engaged, right? Yeah. In those campaigns. So I think the first thing is, to think if we lived in ideal circumstances, this is what I should emphasize, that in ideal circumstances, we would not have fetishized him and we would not have allowed for him to gain so much power and money through the thing. He has so much influence. If you even watch that documentary about the Thanos experiment, that horrible, that blood testing hoax.
That's right, yeah.
He's on all these boards still, right? Like he never dies. For one thing, he's never going to die, apparently.
He's probably going to publish a few more books, I would assume, yeah.
Yes, exactly. He's going to publish books. He's going to keep getting rich. What we need to, and that system is set up not just by evil right-wing people. In fact, Kissinger travels in extremely elite cosmopolitan worlds, right? So in an ideal world, he would be denied that kind of prestige. He would be denied the ability to make so much from his heinous crimes. That's one thing. And just be given enough just to survive on. But also, I think, frankly, directly having to work with the people who have been harmed.
Yeah.
Have been forced, I think, so people who created harm, for instance, there are these movies, right? There have been more than a couple of movies about evil landlords who are made to live. And I think this actually happens in real life as well, where judges have come down with a decision that slumlords must live in the apartment complexes, right? So I think something analogous to that, right? Where you force someone, you take away all the millions they made, you redistribute it to those who need it right now, and you compel them to have to work really closely with the people they have harmed.
Yeah,
right? So
I love that.
If you were in the pharmaceutical industry and you were a price gouging CEO, you would have to go and work closely with people in hospitals suffering from the diseases, right, that could have been treated by generic versions of the pharmaceuticals that you made money off. I mean, to me, that's like super simple and perhaps idealistic and definitely utopian, but I am a utopianist, so I'm okay with that. Right?
I think that's a critical point. Like the utopian thing is like, that's what prison abolition is in a lot of ways, is, people, I think the biggest kind of questions that people throw, maybe even a cliche that people throw at the prison abolitionists is like, well, what do we do with murderers and what do we do with rapists and stuff like that? And those are questions that are really, really hard, but they're especially hard when you're thinking about like changing this system within the larger system of capitalism. In other words, imagining prison abolition and imagining a kind of different kind of engagement with notions of justice would require imagining a change in the entire society and in the entire culture.
Absolutely.
And like that's why prison abolition is the site of such like a rich discourse about utopianism and about refashioning and reimagining society, because that's the site. Like when you look at all the contradictions of capitalism and all the things that are awful about capitalism, you can kind of drill down to the prison as the end point of that conversation. Like the prison exists as the ultimate kind of repudiation to the idea that capitalism is a progressive set of institutions. The prison exists as a kind of like, fuck you, to that very idea, particularly in the United States, which has a bigger prison population than anywhere else. But I struggle with that too in terms of like the question of being like, how do you curb your own punitive instincts? Because, we talked about like seeing an animal being tortured. If I see someone like fucking with an animal, I want to kill that person. I have like a real instinct and rage. But when I think deeply about that, and something I've thought about all my life is my kind of punitive instinct, it's like, well, I'd like to think that part of that is like born out of the culture. Part of that is like, how I was raised. But I also kind of recognize that maybe there's something ape-like in me. There's something Caesar-like that wants to like just bare my teeth and like show a kind of dominance over someone who's done something wrong. And like those are natural instincts, and I feel like that part of it it makes this even harder. But again, like if the institutions and the kind of system kind of limit the ability for those natural instincts of cruelty and sadism to express themselves, then maybe we could head towards limiting the expression of that cruelty and sadism. I don't know. Absolutely. That would be my answer to that question.
No, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's really important for those who create harm to have to confront the consequences of their harm.
Yeah.
But not, again, obviously, when someone, so one of the issues in sort of these kinds of reparative models is that people who've been harmed necessarily don't necessarily want to be confronted by or have to engage with their abusers. So there are obviously ways, to negotiate that as well. But definitely, for instance, in terms of, the victims of price gouging in pharmaceuticals, right, who are actually dying from a lack of access to medications, I think it's important that someone understand the deathly effects of what they did. Now, again, I'm just in complete agreement with you, and I'm just thinking about how can I do this to Kissinger?
Yeah, right. Like
that's a hard one.
Like that's the question is like magical scenario, and all of a sudden we're in charge of administering justice to Henry Kissinger, and we have the power to do whatever we want with him. What are we going to do with him? It's kind of a false question in some sense, because it's kind of like, well, we have to. You're talking about punishment in the context of this society still, and like the punishment in terms of this culture and what we see as justice. And I think that the whole project of prison abolition is about imagining some other world and some other way of like being, and it almost like. Prison abolition is almost the opposite of Planet of the Apes in that it has a kind of faith that human beings can actually evolve past their like basest instincts and not like have to go backwards, but could like maybe go forwards. And that's what I find like kind of disappointing about Planet of the Apes, the Rise of the Planet of the Apes movie, is that the ending is just kind of like, well, they're just going to go backwards into primitive, and that's what's good for them, but it doesn't really get us out of the larger conundrum.
No. And just to get back to Kissinger, I think the motherfucker's never going to change. So he's like a vampire. He's like this evil monster who's just calcified into being even more monstrous. But I think with someone like Kissinger, I think there is something to be said about thinking about how we think about how certain systems don't eject monstrous acts and people, but only incorporate them. And I think Kissinger is very much, for me, he's also and Cheney, very much a part of the celebrity culture as well. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the 90s in particular, right, the 80s and the 90s, Kissinger hit his high point as a celebrity then. You have Barbara Walters and all these women, for instance, boasting practically about how they, frankly, fucked him.
Yeah,
right.
And Hillary Clinton bragged even in the height of the Trump 2016 election. Trump said something actually, I think it was Bernie Sanders who said like, I wouldn't be proud to be friends with Henry Kissinger, and Hillary Clinton loudly, said no, like I'm definitely proud of being friends with Henry Kissinger, to like tons of applause from elites who love that shit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think part of prison abolition politics and utopian politics is also about saying sometimes we can't always provide the exact solution, but we have to start providing ways to think through and interrogate the kind of context, the kind of systems we've set up that enable these things to happen in the first place. So we can't probably, what I would do to Kissinger is simply put him in a house with no help and servants, and make him have to cook his own meals and give him a little ranch house maybe at best, force him to do his own groceries. I think that for Kissinger would be like the most vile punishment. I doubt the man's even used a card on his own in the last 50 years, right? So I think that would be a massive punishment alone for him. And also for him to have to confront, right, the victims of all the wars that he helped perpetrate, for instance, right? But all that being said, I think it's also important for us to remember that sometimes the biggest solution is also to maintain a constant sort of, to be always vigilant about how we enable systems to form in the first place. And I think especially on the left, we have a tendency, for instance, towards celebritifying everything. I mean, look at certain left magazines which are constantly engaged with, we created celebrities out of Sanders and Corbyn. Yeah. And I will maintain till the day I die that is one of the biggest reasons why we have lost.
Yeah. Yeah, and at least I don't know. On the one hand, like to me, it's like Trump's a celebrity and he won the election, right? And so like that works for the right in some ways. I'm not sure how the left can engage that impulse, especially the way that the Democratic Party has been kind of engaging that celebrity impulse. But it's a hard question because it to me, like you're right, like kind of grabbing onto one particular leader as the kind of lens on the whole trajectory of change you want is weird and counterproductive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's still, it's funny because that's still the conversation out of Occupy. We're talking about like 2011 and Rise in Planet of the Apes is like, what do you do with that notion and how do you create power? And it seems like, this last year has been the left, the kind of left we talk about, the ones that have the kind of like control of whatever left media we have. They all went totally in for Bernie Sanders as like that's what left politics is right now. And it seems like, I don't know, if I'm being squirrely about it, I could say like, we are in a pandemic moment. We could have used a lot of that energy. We could have used a lot of that resource. Like where are like all the people that were out like, taking selfies of themselves, like, canvassing for Bernie, where are all those people now canvassing for a rent strike? You know what I mean? And right. I know that's kind of like a random thing to put on them and say, where are you? Because maybe they are out there. But it seems like the level of energy and excitement that got sucked up into the Bernie campaign would have been really useful in like regional projects that are meant to like organize people on the ground and literally do like, the kinds of material benefit programs that like we need to create the kind of solidarity that the left is always envisioning. So like that part of it, would be very useful, mutual benefit organizations or something during this moment. I know we're all kind of like bowled over by the fact that we're, it's hard to organize when we're separated like this. But at the same time, it feels like in hindsight, the Bernie campaign took up a lot of energy that could have been used in kind of preparing for these moments and getting us, to a place where we can build power apart from just the kind of let's vote for one person every 4 years.
Yes, I mean, right.
I know I threw a lot out there to respond to.
No. Yeah, no. I mean, I think, it's sort of like things sometimes do take a lot of time, right? So Occupy I do think that there were seeds that were sowed during Occupied, and some of that is what we're seeing now, perhaps, right? So but at the same time, I think there's a tendency in American politics in particular to only think about something when there's a spark, when there's a sort of a central figure that helps us coalesce around issues. We're not very good at thinking diffusively, right? We're not thinking, to get back actually to the movie, right? When you think about that last astonishing, sequence of the takeover of the bridge, a lot of that had to do with people understanding that they would all be working, or rather the apes, right? Working in very separate pods, but at the same time working collectively. This idea of demolition through collectivity, but a collectivity that is not massed in one place, that is really radical revolutionary politics. And I think if we were to think that way, right, about radical political change, we would be better off. But I think what's happening right now is and I feel this, and I think you feel this as well, right? As someone, if I bring up I wasn't even freaking critiquing the post office. I was just asking, the post office sucks. What are we going to do about it? Why are you supporting something that sucks, right? But to even merely ask questions on the left is verboten, and there's no sense of, there are these different ways in which we create attack, right? Mm-hmm. Rather, also because the left is, what we all also ignore on the left is that there's a lot of money and power in play for a lot of people on the left, right? So there are writers, for instance, who just flat out profit from the many think pieces they're able to generate over and over again. There are left magazines that profit because they don't have to pay their writers, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is a part of the left system. So what we don't have is a left that is actually thinking in actual radical revolutionary terms of constant attack, constant, realignments, and so on.
I agree. And
concentration of power.
Yeah, I agree. And it feels like this is a moment where, that's been a frustration of the left for a long time. It's like, what's with all this fucking talking? All we do is talk and fight and never really build anything. It seems like this is a moment more than any other that's like an opportunity to kind of have more of the kind of practice. Moving forward in the way you're talking about it to me, it goes back to where we started with this conversation, which is that, there's a kind of regional flavor to what's happening, and people are experiencing it differently. I mean, I find myself on Facebook a lot more recently because the conversation on Twitter is so national and the Facebook conversation seems so local. I have lots of, I follow pages that are around, the cities and towns that I live in, and it's a different kind of engagement with the lived experience of American life. And if there's anything, if there's any hope I find in that, it's that we can kind of find a footing in practicing a different kind of maybe smaller leftism. That I love your analogy of the apes fighting at the bridge at the end, because they're all part of one movement, but they're also all kind of doing their own thing, and doing their own thing according to their own kind of skill set, right? The orangutans are underneath the bridge, etc. But they all know that they're part of one project. So I don't know. There's a lot more to talk about, but I always have such a fun time unpacking this stuff with you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll talk.
Thank you.
We'll talk again soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Okay, I had a great time talking with Yasmin. There's stuff from this conversation that I'm still thinking about. I'm still wondering if what I said was correct and if I need to kind of go back and think harder on some of these things. And if you want to hear more of me and Peter Sabatino talking about kind of the regional element of what's going on locally, that's on our vibe check this week. So go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We've got lots of stuff going on in the Patreon. We're really thinking hard about kind of how to use this moment and what it means that we're in a moment that seems pliable. In other words, history seems more movable than before. I know it's easy to think that the left has no power right now, and I think that in some ways that's true. But at the same time, we have no idea where things are going. And a movie like Planet of the Apes, as silly as it is in some ways, it can provide a kind of set of ideas and a set of models for how to kind of navigate a global crisis. So I had a really great time talking with Yasmin. I hope you enjoyed that and enjoy all our Nostalgia Trap stuff at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We'll talk to you all again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.